This service deals with death and brutality. Please take care of yourselves. The hymn Ave Verum Corpus, Hail the True Body, is a mournful piece about Jesus' suffering for staying in the fight. We can't really have Easter without Good Friday and the lament of loss. Jesus died a horrible death, tortured and politically persecuted for speaking out. Crucifixion was suffocation. We know of many who have been persecuted and murdered for speaking out, and there are countless people out there who have lost someone of importance for staying in the fight, or maybe just for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. It can be a terrible loss. Mohandas Gandhi, assassinated for staying in the fight. Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., assassinated for staying in the fight. Alexei Navalny, murdered by Russia for staying in the fight. Jesus, crucified for staying in the fight. Our reading this morning comes from the book Universalism 101 by Richard Trudeau. He wrote, well, like many Unitarian Universalists, Richard Trudeau was raised Christian, but he left that faith because his religious curiosity was suffocated and the dogma was terrifying. After many years as a UU, he rediscovered elements of Christianity that he now understood differently, especially about the man called Jesus. He wrote, "Crucifixion was a deliberately cruel way of executing a non-Roman citizen who was to be made an example of because they were a threat to the empire." A cross, Trudeau says, is a reminder that Jesus was indeed a threat to the Roman Empire because his message of radical egalitarianism was subversive of the empire's patronage-based, slave-supported, hierarchical system. Trudeau says, "I now see the cross as a warning and a call. The warning is that defending oppressed people is dangerous. The call is that we're supposed to do it anyway." Christianity is a faith many UUs have experienced and rejected just like Trudeau did. But I trust we can draw meaning from the actual events of history and the stories we tell to make sense of them. For example, hear how UU minister Amy Brooks interprets Good Friday in her poem, Last Gasp. "You would think all Israel had been there, the way people go on about it. My cousin's aunt's neighbor loves to brag about being in the crowd and pushing to the front for her own special blessing. And I know for a fact that she has never traveled further than a half-day's walk from Nain. There's all kinds of talk about what he said or didn't say or sang or didn't sing, as if he could do anything more than beg for breath and for his mama. But we who were truly present will never forget her voice. You haven't known pain until you've witnessed the wide-mouthed scream of a mother whose child has been murdered by an unjust state, by authorities who require that she crowdfund and beg until she can afford to bury the body. The pain is breathtaking." The warning is that defending oppressed people is dangerous. The call is that we're supposed to do it anyway. Jesus did it anyway. And I think sometimes we forget that part of the story because Christian nationalism saps our understanding by taking a faith and using it to oppress rather than to liberate. UUs clearly want something beyond the God Bless the USA America Bible, sold by former president for only $60. We UUs say we are a pluralistic faith, that we encourage spiritual growth and the search for meaning, and we draw on various scriptures for inspiration, such as the earth-centered stories we heard at the beginning of the service. I hope we can remember the liberating messages of Christianity rather than discard the whole thing. The Holy Week story might give some meaning and hope to UUs as well. Let's tell it. Jesus, the man from Nazareth, was in radical opposition to the religious leaders of the time and a threat to them and to the government. He came into Jerusalem, they say, maybe on a Sunday, to great accolades and hosannas, and people carpeted the streets with palm fronds. By Monday, he had a temple tantrum, and the religious leaders turned on him. On Friday, he had a dinner. Some of the people who were beloved to him betrayed him, others left him. Eventually, religion and politics conspired to crucify him. Some number, especially the women, stayed with him as he died, keeping watch with fear and dread. The pain was breathtaking. Those who stayed with him had to live in that liminal space, that period of waiting between something ending and the future unknown, from Hosanna to crucifixion, from crucifixion to resurrection, from vast political turmoil to unspeakable emptiness. Imagine it. After all, he was their leader. They looked to him to help shape the future. Can you just hear them? Now what do we do? We are on that threshold when something has ended and we know something new will begin, but we don't know what. We pause in what Kate Walker calls the rumble of time. In a space of uncertainty, of not knowing, and of not quite clear possibility, it's a time where we might wonder impatiently, when will this waiting end? It might also be a time where we can create something new by using the gift of emptiness and not knowing, the gift of not knowing. We can create a new story. What happens in the space between the despair of an ending and the unknown future is in many ways up to us. 20th century theologian John Knox distinguishes between Christian belief and empirical fact. The belief is the story we tell about the experience the community had. Beliefs are part of the story, but not necessarily part of the factual events. You see, crucifixion is the event. After time passes, we get through that liminal space that followed the event of the crucifixion and move on to the resurrection. Resurrection is the story. Many UUs will agree that Jesus, the man, lived, walked the earth, was a teacher and a healer. The event of the crucifixion is the political persecution of a justice activist. Many scholars believe this event occurred. But what story might we tell of the resurrection? Let's revisit those events. After the crucifixion, you may recall, Jesus' body was hastily placed into a tomb. A few days after he died, the women who were with him at his death went to the tomb to properly care for the body. But the stone in front of the tomb had been rolled away, and the body was gone. Talk about liminal space. Imagine the emptiness they must have felt that they didn't even have a body to hold on to. They summoned all the other disciples. And this is where the story begins. What happened to him? In the book, The Source of Human Good, Henry Nelson Wyman wrote a version of the resurrection that left me with a greater understanding, a story about resurrection that I could appreciate and relate to as a humanist. Wyman is a process theologian, which means God is in the relationships among us. God is that creative work that comes out of our interactions with one another, often during liminal time. It is the creative emergence of something new, maybe the creation of a better story. It is the whole that is greater than the sum of things. We can be the creators of a better world. Now, this was a way that I could relate to God language and be okay with a concept like resurrection. Here's how Wyman said it. When Jesus was crucified, his followers saw that he could never carry to fulfillment the mission of the Jewish people as they had conceived it. They had thought that he would save the world by making supreme over human existence the good, as seen in the perspective of Jewish culture. Now they saw that he could never do anything of the sort. He was not the Messiah they had expected, and as far as they could tell, he was no Messiah at all. The depth of devotion and the glory of the vision they had possessed made their disillusionment all the more bitter and devastating. They had given up everything for him, and now he was shown to have no good in him of the sort they could understand or appreciate. They reached that depth of despair which comes when all that seems to give hope to human existence is seen to be an illusion. This was the immediate consequence of the crucifixion. After about the third day, however, when the numbness of the shock had worn away, something happened. The life-transforming creativity previously known only in fellowship with Jesus began to work in the fellowship of the disciples. It was risen from the dead, it meaning that creative fellowship. The creative fellowship was risen from the dead. Wyman continues, since they had never experienced it except in association with Jesus, it seemed to them that the man Jesus himself was actually present, walking and talking with them. Some thought they saw him and touched him in physical presence. But what rose from the dead was not the man Jesus, it was creative power. It was the living God that works in time. So you see, my friends, the life-transforming creativity of fellowship began to work in the disciples again. His presence among them wasn't him. It was that creative spirit. His memory is what they resurrected. Jesus was gone, but his lessons persisted. Jesus wasn't raised from the dead. His physical being wasn't resurrected. But the disciples were transformed by his life and their memory of fellowship with him. What were those stories he told? Maybe we should tell them too? Maybe you've had that feeling that someone who has died is right there with you. I have. All that stuff they said and did, all the parables Jesus told, the disciples now had to interpret. All the love he showed to the poor, the lepers, the prostitutes, and Samaritans. What was that? It was a message of love made alive in actions for justice. Jesus asked his disciples before he was crucified to be fishers of men. His fisher folk formed a band of students known as disciples. Then apostles, people the disciples taught, chose to carry this understanding and memory of Jesus elsewhere, and off they went. And some 10 years later, an apostle named Paul transformed the lessons he heard from those disciples into something new, for better or worse. He helped create the story and the Christian church, which is different than the events we learned about the man from Nazareth. What if we could apply his lesson of love and acceptance to issues of immigration, of mass incarceration, or homophobia, transphobia, or Islamophobia? Jesus would not have stood for these oppressions, or for racism, or misogyny, or anti-Semitism. After all, it was the women who stayed with him until the end. Jesus stood in the face of empire and oppression, and he criticized it. He died for it. And modern Christianity has built up into what it is today over thousands of years. So what story do we make of the events of history? What will we do to help something creative and new emerge and improve who we are? These questions really matter. We can choose what to do with those in-between times. Uncertainty is a challenging space to be in, and these times sure feel uncertain to me. But when we stay in relationship with each other and work together, creative things can happen. That was what the disciples began to do outside the tomb. In that liminal space, we can open the power to hope, experience goodness, turn despair into opportunity, recreate and reawaken, maybe resurrect what is most valuable to us. What new loving revolution might we create? Let us do what we can with one another, standing in the face of empire. That's what this season is about for me. Jesus preached a message of love thy neighbor and taught others to do the same. It is our loving relationships that will always win in the end by creating something new in the world. When we are in liminal space, we can learn together how to create a new story. Let us move out of this time of uncertainty to form loving communities, to support one another, to learn to be gentle with one another, and to share that lesson. Molly Hosh Gordon says, even when everything is uncertain, even when we are grieving, even when the loss keeps coming, even when we are forced apart, even when we are bone weary, we keep reaching for one another. We keep rising in love. Let the fellowship among us create the world we want to see, a world of love and justice. Let us work for it, even if it's hard. Let us change the story of fear and anger toward others into one of love thy neighbor. May we create the events of human goodness. May we tell the stories that inspire goodness. May it be so, and may we make it so. Amen.